Welcome. Tonight, I'll take you back to the dark, yet fascinating world of the Middle Ages. You can close your eyes or simply listen to my voice. Take a deep breath and let the words gently carry you toward sleep. In this video, we'll explore why plagues were so common in medieval times. But don't worry, everything will move slowly, peacefully. If you enjoy this kind of story, please consider subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? Your words always mean a lot, and a little like helps this journey reach others too. Now, if you're ready, let's begin. Imagine, for a moment, that you've just woken up. Not in your comfortable bed, surrounded by 21st century conveniences, but in a small, damp, and dimly lit hut somewhere in rural medieval Europe. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something vaguely unpleasant. There's no soft mattress, just a straw pallet. No alarm clock, just a faint rooster crow and distant pig grunts. This isn't a historical reenactment. This is your new reality. The romanticized image of the Middle Ages, often portrayed in popular culture, depicts a period of valiant knights and noble royalty, with gleaming armor and majestic castles. Yet, the stark reality of the medieval era was profoundly different. For us, accustomed to modern comforts, daily existence then would be an unrelenting battle for survival. This series aims to delve into the often overlooked, grittier, harsher, and frequently brutal truths of the Middle Ages. Each segment will confront you with a distinct challenge, illustrating precisely why you likely wouldn't have endured even a single day. This initial dive will dismantle prevalent misconceptions and introduce you to the raw, unvarnished reality of the era. The medieval period broadly spans approximately 1,000 years, from around 500 AD to 1500 AD. This monumental expanse of time begins with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and concludes with the advent of the Renaissance, Reformation, and Age of Discovery. Within this vast period, common misconceptions persist. For instance, the notion of the Middle Ages as exclusively a dark age is largely a construct of Enlightenment thinkers. While challenges like widespread plagues, constant warfare, and feudalism were undeniable, it was not a period devoid of scientific or technological advancement. Improvements in agriculture, widespread windmills, architectural marvels like cathedrals, and the establishment of the first universities all belong to this era. Nevertheless, for a contemporary individual, adapting to this epoch would be virtually impossible. Life expectancy was remarkably low, hovering around 30 to 40 years on average. While high infant mortality rates depressed this figure, even for adults, life was fraught with perils. Malnutrition, constant epidemic threats, and rudimentary medical practices could render even minor ailments fatal. A simple toothache, for example, was excruciating, often with dangerous extraction as the only remedy. Your daily routines would be shockingly divergent from modern conveniences. There was no electricity, no refrigeration, no internet. Access to information was severely limited. Literacy rates were low, and books were luxurious, scarce commodities. Entertainment was confined to communal activities like simple games, storytelling, or religious festivals. Leisure time, as we know it, was virtually non-existent. Most of one's life was consumed by the struggle for survival and relentless labor. The social structure was rigidly hierarchical. Your birth class typically determined your entire life's trajectory. If born a peasant, you would almost certainly die a peasant. Nobles might enjoy more comfort, but would still be embroiled in warfare and political intrigues. Women's rights and roles were severely constrained compared to modern standards. Marriages were frequently arranged for political or economic advantage, with love matches being a rarity. In stark contrast to our contemporary metropolises, medieval towns and cities were overcrowded, unsanitary, and cacophonous. Animals, waste, and people coexisted in close, unsanitary proximity on the streets. Fires posed an immense threat, as timber structures and narrow alleyways facilitated rapid flame propagation. In rural areas, life was more isolated and linked to nature's whims. Bandits lurked, wild animals posed threats, and harsh weather conditions were constant adversaries for farmers. Each topic we will explore in this series will underscore just how formidable and unforgiving the Middle Ages truly were. The comfort and security modern humans take for granted were luxuries unimaginable to those living then. Are you prepared to confront these realities? We will continue to reveal why you wouldn't have lasted even a single day in medieval times. Welcome to your second day in the Middle Ages, or perhaps just a few hours in, and the first thing you'd notice is an immediate, inescapable assault on your senses: the overpowering smell. Forget your daily showers, your fragrant soaps, your clean, fresh laundry, and the subtle pleasantries of modern deodorants and perfumes. In medieval times, personal cleanliness as we know it simply didn't exist for the vast majority of the population. Bathing was a rare occurrence for most commoners, often communal, and the water was frequently not changed between users, turning a supposed cleansing act into a shared dirt bath. Soap, if available at all, was a harsh, alkaline substance, far removed from the gentle, skin-friendly products of today, and its use was limited. This meant that pervasive body odor was not just common. It was the overwhelming, undeniable norm. Imagine constant, deeply ingrained human and animal smells, mixed with the stench of decaying refuse, stagnant water, and damp, unwashed clothing, a potent and nauseating cocktail that would immediately overwhelm and sicken your modern nose. Beyond the sheer olfactory assault, your body would immediately encounter another major, unavoidable challenge: parasites. Fleas and lice were an omnipresent, inescapable part of medieval life, regardless of your social status. They would reside comfortably in your hair, infest your clothes, and colonize your straw bedding, causing constant itching, skin irritation, and unbearable discomfort. There were no effective shampoos, delousing treatments, or even strong repellents, so you would simply have to endure their constant presence and their incessant biting. This wasn't just a minor annoyance. These parasites were known carriers of various diseases, including the terrifying bubonic plague, making them a significant and deadly health risk. Furthermore, public sanitation was virtually non-existent in urban and even rural areas. Human and animal waste was often simply thrown into the streets from windows or flowed through open gutters, serving as open sewers. Latrines were rudimentary pits, offering no privacy and contributing massively to the overall putrid atmosphere that clung to every town and village. Even inside homes and castles, waste disposal was primitive at best. Chamber pots were emptied indiscriminately onto the street below or into the castle moat, attracting rats and flies and spreading disease. The very concept of a clean environment, as understood today, was almost alien to medieval sensibilities. Dust, grime, and cobwebs were everywhere, coating every surface. Clothes were rarely subjected to proper washing. Instead, they were often just beaten with sticks to remove loose dirt and dust. They were typically made of coarse, heavy fabrics like wool, which absorbed smells and rarely aired out, meaning you'd be living in a constant state of accumulated filth. Imagine wearing the same outer garments for weeks, even months, without any true cleaning process, allowing dirt, sweat, and odors to build up layer by layer. The lack of clean, potable drinking water was another monumental issue. While some larger towns might have possessed rudimentary aqueducts, many communities relied on wells or rivers that were frequently contaminated by human and animal waste. This contamination was a primary cause of frequent and debilitating bouts of waterborne illnesses like dysentery and cholera. To avoid the dangers of unsafe water, many people, including children, drank weak ale or cider, as the fermentation process, however slight, killed some of the harmful pathogens, making it safer than water. Your first encounter with a bustling medieval market or a crowded town square would be an overwhelming sensory experience for reasons far beyond just the visual spectacle. The combined stench of unwashed bodies, decomposing animal manure, rotting food scraps, and stale, unmoving air would create an unbearable, stomach-churning miasma for anyone accustomed to modern hygiene standards. This wasn't just a matter of profound discomfort, it directly and profoundly impacted public health. The constant exposure to a myriad of pathogens from contaminated water, unhygienic food practices, and utterly inadequate waste management made everyone susceptible to a terrifying array of diseases that would be easily treatable today. Your pampered skin and highly sensitive modern nose would face a relentless, inescapable assault, and the sheer discomfort of constant itching from parasites, combined with the pervasive, sickening odors, would likely be enough to make you desperately long for the clean, sterile environment of your own time. The medieval world was a harsh, unrelenting reality check for any notion of personal cleanliness and public health. Congratulations! You've somehow managed to navigate the sensory onslaught of medieval hygiene and the persistent irritation of parasites. Now, prepare yourself for a far more fundamental and terrifying concern: getting enough to eat, and crucially, ensuring that what you do eat won't kill you. Forget the blissful luxury of choosing from thousands of diverse, fresh, and perfectly safe food items in a climate-controlled supermarket. In the Middle Ages, that vision was a fantastical, unreachable utopia. Most people, especially the vast peasant class, lived on a subsistence diet, meaning they consumed just enough calories to survive, and often not even that if they were truly fortunate. Your daily meal would primarily consist of coarse, often dense and gritty bread, frequently made from inferior grains like barley or rye. This might be supplemented with a meager gruel, a thin porridge made from oats or other grains, or a few seasonal root vegetables if they were in season and available. Meat was an exceptionally rare luxury, almost exclusively reserved for the wealthy nobility and clergy, or for special feast days and religious celebrations for the common folk. When meat was consumed, the methods of preservation were rudimentary at best and far from foolproof. Salting, smoking, or drying were the common techniques. But these methods were imperfect and could still allow harmful bacteria to thrive, especially if not executed perfectly. This led to frequent and often agonizing bouts of food poisoning, which, without modern medicine, could very easily be fatal, particularly for children or the infirm. Beyond meat, dairy products like milk were often consumed in fermented forms like cheese or butter due to rapid spoilage, and fruits were only available seasonally, if at all. However, the largest, most terrifying, and ever-present threat was the shadow of famine. A single bad harvest, whether caused by a prolonged drought, excessive and persistent rain, an unexpected and devastating flood, or a widespread pest infestation, meant widespread hunger, subsequent disease, and mass death. There were no global food supply chains to import sustenance from distant lands, no sophisticated relief organizations, and no government reserves to distribute to the starving populace. If your local crops failed, you and your entire family would face the grim certainty of starvation. Periods of severe famine could decimate significant portions of the population, leading to widespread social unrest, desperate migrations in search of food, and an alarming rise in lawlessness and desperate measures as people fought for survival. Food preparation itself was also fraught with peril. Cooking was typically done over open fires, making it incredibly difficult to control temperatures and ensure thorough cooking, leaving many foods undercooked and potentially hazardous. Food storage was primitive. Without refrigeration, perishables spoiled quickly, especially in warmer months, inviting pests like rats and insects that further contaminated food supplies. Even the most basic necessity, drinking water, was often unsafe. While some larger towns might have had rudimentary aqueducts, many communities relied on wells or rivers that were frequently contaminated by human and animal waste due to poor sanitation. This contamination was a leading cause of frequent and debilitating bouts of waterborne illnesses such as dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. To mitigate the dangers of unsafe water, many people, including children, predominantly drank weak ale or cider, as the fermentation process, however slight, produced alcohol that acted as a natural disinfectant, killing some of the harmful pathogens and making it a safer alternative to raw water. Imagine the constant gnawing anxiety of where your next meal would come from, the pervasive fear of seeing your children go hungry, of your entire community succumbing to the ravages of famine. Could your body, accustomed to a balanced and diverse diet, rich in essential vitamins and minerals, cope with a monotonous intake that barely met caloric needs, let alone nutritional ones? Nutritional deficiencies were rampant, leading to various chronic health problems, stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and overall susceptibility to disease. The medieval world was a place where death by starvation wasn't a historical footnote or a distant concept. It was a very real and tragically frequent possibility that loomed over every household, a constant shadow in daily life. Your well-fed, modern body would find itself in a constant, desperate battle against chronic hunger, debilitating contamination, and the ever-present threat of a failed harvest. You've somehow managed to navigate the medieval world's overwhelming smells, the persistent irritation of parasites, and the gnawing anxiety of food scarcity. But now, you must steel yourself for perhaps the most immediate, terrifying, and omnipresent threat of all in the Middle Ages, disease, and the utterly primitive, often fatal, state of medicine. In this era, human life was incredibly fragile, constantly teetering on the edge. A simple cut, which today would merely warrant a band-aid and perhaps a dab of antiseptic, could easily lead to a deadly infection, rapidly spreading to sepsis and death. A common cold, a minor inconvenience for us, could quickly escalate into fatal pneumonia, and widespread epidemics, like the Black Death, could decimate entire populations, wiping out towns and villages in a matter of months, sometimes weeks. Without any understanding of germ theory, the crucial importance of hygiene, or effective treatments like antibiotics, people were terrifyingly vulnerable to an endless array of pathogens. Imagine falling gravely ill. Instead of consulting a modern doctor who prescribes targeted medication based on scientific diagnosis, you would likely encounter a physician, or far more commonly, a local barber surgeon or herbalist. These practitioners relied on ancient, often mystical theories, such as the widely accepted belief in the four humors, the idea that the body was made up of four basic fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was attributed to an imbalance of these humors, and treatments often involved drastic measures like extensive bloodletting, applying heated cups to the skin, cupping, or prescribing leeches to balance the body. These practices, while often well-intentioned within their limited understanding, typically weakened the already ailing patient and, critically, vastly increased the risk of secondary infection. Surgeries were brutal, agonizing affairs, performed without any form of effective anesthesia, sterilization, or even a basic concept of pain management beyond perhaps biting down on a stick, drinking strong alcohol, or enduring the agony silently. The pain would be unimaginable, and the risk of post-operative infection was almost a certainty, frequently leading to a slow, agonizing death from sepsis or gangrene. Childbirth was an incredibly risky endeavor for both mother and child, with alarmingly high mortality rates due to infection, hemorrhage, and the complete lack of trained medical assistants, often relying on untrained midwives. Infant and child mortality were shockingly rampant. It was tragically common for families to lose multiple children before they reached adulthood, making the concept of a large surviving family a rarity. And then, of course, there were the great sweeping plagues. The most devastating of these, the Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, is estimated to have killed an astonishing 30% to 60% of the entire population. There was no known cure, no understanding of how it spread beyond vague superstitions, divine punishment, or bad air, miasma theory. Only widespread panic, profound fear, and desperate prayers. Entire communities were obliterated, and the very social fabric of society was torn apart by the scale of the devastation. Could your modern body, accustomed to the protection of vaccinations, the efficacy of antiseptics, and readily available advanced medical care, endure the constant insidious threat of a deadly illness? Could you watch your loved ones succumb to diseases that today are easily treatable? A simple appendicitis, a bacterial infection, or even a common flu strain, powerless to help them beyond offering meager comfort or reciting prayers. The medieval world was, in essence, a relentless microbial battlefield, where every interaction, every breath, every minor injury or slight discomfort carried the terrifying potential for a swift, agonizing, and unavoidable end. humans were largely unarmed against the unseen enemies lurking everywhere, making everyday existence a terrifying roll of the dice with death. You've miraculously navigated the medieval world's overwhelming smells, the gnawing anxiety of food scarcity, and the constant threat of deadly disease. But now, you must confront its system of justice. A system that would be utterly alien and terrifying to anyone accustomed to modern legal principles. Forget your Miranda rights, the fundamental presumption of innocence until proven guilty, the right to a fair and impartial trial, or even the basic concept of a jury of your peers. In the Middle Ages, the framework of law and order was vastly different from ours, often arbitrary, profoundly influenced by social status, and relentlessly brutal in its application. Justice was dispensed according to complex and varied feudal customs, the often whimsical dictates of local lords, or terrifyingly, through rigid religious dogma. Imagine being accused of a crime, whether you were genuinely innocent or guilty. Your fate might be decided not by rational evidence, careful legal argument, or the testimony of witnesses, but by trial by ordeal. This meant undergoing a physically excruciating and life-threatening test, with the outcome believed to be supernaturally determined by divine intervention. For instance, you might be forced to hold a red-hot iron, walk across burning coals, or be thrown into cold water with your hands and feet bound. If your severe burns miraculously healed quickly, or if you floated in the case of water, you were declared innocent. If not, you were deemed guilty, often signifying God's judgment against you. This was not about forensic evidence or logical reasoning, but about a desperate gamble for divine favor, or simply enduring unimaginable pain. Alternatively, you might face trial by combat, where your guilt or innocence was decided by a physical duel against your accuser or a champion. If you lost, you were guilty, regardless of the actual facts of the case, and often faced execution or mutilation on the spot. Punishments for crimes, even those considered minor by today's standards, were incredibly severe and almost always public, designed not for rehabilitation, but to deter others through maximum fear and spectacular public humiliation. Theft, for example, could result in a brutal public whipping, agonizing mutilation, like having your hand cut off or ears cropped, being placed in stocks, or a pillory for public ridicule and assault, or even immediate hanging. More serious crimes, such as murder, treason against the Lord or King, or heresy, almost invariably led to execution, often in the most gruesome and prolonged ways imaginable. Executions were grand public spectacles, meticulously staged events meant to reinforce the Lord's absolute power and serve as a chilling, visceral warning to the populace. Common methods included hanging, beheading, burning at the stake, especially for religious offenses or alleged witchcraft, or even being drawn and quartered, a prolonged and excruciating dismemberment. The deeply ingrained feudal system meant that your rights, or more accurately, your severe lack thereof, were almost entirely determined by your social standing at birth. A peasant or serf had far fewer rights and legal protections than a noble. Lords often held absolute, unchecked power over their serfs and tenants, frequently acting as judge, jury, and executioner with little oversight or appeal. Corruption was rampant throughout the system, and bribery was a common and often necessary tool to secure any semblance of a favorable outcome or even basic consideration. There was no real police force as we understand it today, only local watchmen or the Lord's personal guards, whose primary loyalty was often to the Lord and his interests, not to abstract notions of justice or public safety. Could you endure living in a society where your life, your limb, and your liberty could be forfeit on the arbitrary whim of a powerful individual or by a test designed solely to inflict maximum pain and test your divine favor? The medieval justice system was less about equitable fairness and more about maintaining order through absolute terror, public humiliation, and the constant, imminent threat of agonizing punishment. Your modern understanding of human rights and due process would be not just useless, but a dangerous liability. You've somehow navigated the medieval world's sensory overload, the constant threat of starvation, and the brutal whims of its justice system. Now, let's talk about how you'd spend your days. Working. Forget the 9-to-5 workday, ergonomic chairs, climate control, or even a guaranteed weekend. In the Middle Ages, life was a relentless cycle of physically demanding labor from sunup to sundown, with little respite. For the vast majority, this meant toil in the fields. If you were a peasant or a serf, your life revolved entirely around agriculture, growing food not just for yourself and your family, but primarily for your Lord and the church. Imagine waking with the first light, often before, and heading to the fields where you would work until darkness fell. This wasn't just during planting and harvest seasons. Agricultural labor was year-round. The tools you'd use were primitive and incredibly inefficient by modern standards. You'd be plowing with oxen and a wooden plow, often breaking up tough soil by hand. Harvesting crops meant using scythes and sickles, bending over for hours under the sun or in the rain. There was no machinery, no pesticides, no sophisticated irrigation systems. Every task, from sowing seeds to threshing grain, was performed manually, relying solely on human and animal muscle power. This was backbreaking work that took a severe toll on the body. Chronic pain, arthritis, and deformities were common, signs of a life spent in constant physical exertion. Injuries were frequent. A misstep with a scythe, a kick from an ox, or a fall could result in permanent disability or death, with no workers' compensation or modern medical treatment available. Beyond farming, other professions were equally demanding. If you were a craftsman, a blacksmith, carpenter, weaver, or mason, your work hours were just as long, often spent in cramped, poorly lit workshops. Apprenticeships lasted years, demanding dedication and obedience, and the work was highly skilled but physically taxing. Blacksmiths toiled by roaring fires, enduring intense heat and swinging heavy hammers all day. Masons lifted heavy stones with rudimentary hoists, risking crushing injuries. Artisans often lived and worked in the same space, with little separation between their professional and personal lives. The concept of weekends or regular days off was not standard. Work would continue unless it was a major religious holiday, and even then, many necessary chores would still need doing. Your body, accustomed to relatively sedentary modern life, would quickly rebel. The constant physical exertion, coupled with inadequate nutrition and poor sanitation, would lead to exhaustion, illness, and rapid aging. The average peasant's body, hardened by a lifetime of labor, would still bear the marks of this relentless toil. There was little opportunity for advancement or a change in profession. You were born into your role, and that was largely your destiny. This lack of social mobility meant that generations would follow the same demanding routines, passing down the burdens of hard labor from parent to child. The idea of a retirement age was non existent. You worked until your body gave out, or you died. Surviving in medieval times meant embracing a life of continuous, physically draining work, a reality that would quickly break anyone accustomed to a desk job or even lighter manual labor. You've managed to survive the incessant labor, but now imagine you need to travel, perhaps to a neighboring town for a market, to fulfill a feudal obligation, or in rare cases as a pilgrim. Forget paved roads, comfortable vehicles, or even the certainty of reaching your destination safely and quickly. Medieval travel was an arduous, dangerous, and often terrifying undertaking, a true test of endurance. There were no well-maintained highways. Roads were little more than dirt tracks, often muddy, rutted, and impassable during bad weather. Bridges were rare and often dilapidated, meaning you'd frequently have to ford rivers, risking drowning or losing your meager possessions. The speed of travel was agonizingly slow. On foot, you'd be lucky to cover 20 to 30 miles a day, assuming good terrain and no obstacles. With a cart or pack animal, it was even slower. A journey that takes a few hours by car today could easily take days or weeks, transforming into an epic odyssey. This meant exposing yourself to the elements for extended periods, risking hypothermia, sunstroke, or severe dehydration. Your modern soft footwear would be useless. You'd need sturdy, perhaps wooden-soled, boots just to protect your feet from the harsh ground. But the biggest threat on the roads wasn't the terrain or the weather, it was the people. Bandits, highwaymen, and desperate vagrants were a constant menace. Without organized police forces, law enforcement on rural roads was virtually non-existent. Travelers were easy targets for robbery, assault, and even murder. Carrying any valuables meant putting your life at significant risk. Even if you escaped bandits, you might encounter rogue soldiers, deserters, or even petty lords who could demand tolls or simply seize your goods with impunity. Staying in inns along the way was another gamble. While some offered basic shelter, they were often dirty, overcrowded, and rife with disease. Theft was common, and the company could be dangerous. Navigation was also primitive. There were no detailed maps as we know them, just general directions, landmarks, and local knowledge. Getting lost in unfamiliar territory, especially in dense forests or unpopulated areas, was a real danger. Such a situation could lead to starvation, exposure, or falling prey to wild animals like wolves. Travel was also highly dependent on the political climate. During times of war or unrest, roads could become battlegrounds or simply too dangerous to traverse. Any journey undertaken was a calculated risk, fraught with physical dangers, the constant threat of robbery, and the ever-present possibility of never reaching your destination. Your modern reliance on GPS and safe, efficient transportation would quickly highlight just how utterly unprepared you are for the medieval road. You've miraculously survived your journey to a medieval town or city, perhaps hoping for better prospects than the countryside. Prepare for another shocking reality. Forget wide boulevards, public parks, and efficient infrastructure. Medieval cities were dense, chaotic, and incredibly unsanitary, a labyrinth of challenges that would push your modern sensibilities to their breaking point. City walls, built for defense, meant limited space, leading to extreme overcrowding. Buildings were packed tightly together, often with upper stories overhanging the narrow, winding streets. creating dark, damp alleys where sunlight rarely reached. The streets themselves were a disaster zone. Paved only in the wealthiest districts, most were dirt tracks, often covered in mud, refuse, and the waste of both humans and animals. Open sewers were common, carrying human excrement and other waste directly through the streets or into nearby rivers, which also served as sources of drinking water. Imagine walking through streets reeking of garbage, urine, and feces, constantly dodging animal droppings and pools of stagnant, putrid water. Sanitation was an alien concept. Garbage was often simply thrown out of windows onto the street below, creating towering piles of rotting refuse. Rats, flies, and other vermin thrived in these conditions, acting as vectors for disease. Overcrowding meant that diseases spread like wildfire. A single infected person could quickly trigger an epidemic that would sweep through the densely packed population. Common diseases like dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and of course, the ever-present plague found ideal breeding grounds in the unsanitary conditions. Hospitals, if they existed, were more like hospices, offering little in the way of actual medical treatment, and often becoming further centers of infection. The air itself was often polluted by the smoke from countless hearths and workshops, adding to respiratory ailments. Fires were a constant, terrifying threat. With buildings made largely of timber, packed tightly together and relying on open flames for cooking and heating, a single spark could quickly ignite a devastating conflagration. Without organized fire departments or modern firefighting equipment, a fire could consume entire city blocks or even entire cities in a matter of hours, leaving thousands homeless and destitute. The noise level would also be overwhelming. Unlike modern cities with zoning laws, medieval cities mixed residential areas with noisy workshops, bustling markets, and the constant din of daily life. Blacksmiths hammering, vendors shouting, church bells ringing, and animals braying. Your modern need for personal space, quiet, and cleanliness would be utterly unfulfilled. Surviving in a medieval city meant accepting a life of constant filth, noise, overcrowding, and the ever-present threat of disease and disaster. If city life sounds unbearable, perhaps you'd prefer the tranquility of the medieval countryside. Prepare for a different, yet equally profound, set of challenges. Far from a peaceful idyll, rural life in the Middle Ages was characterized by extreme isolation, relentless labor, and a constant, precarious battle against the forces of nature and humanity. Most of the population lived in small, scattered villages, often many miles from the nearest town or other significant settlements. This isolation meant limited access to goods, services, and information. News traveled slowly, if at all, and your world would be confined to your immediate village and the surrounding fields. Imagine being entirely dependent on the land for your survival. Your life and the lives of your family hung precariously on the success of the harvest. A bad season, due to drought, flood, or pests, meant not just hardship, but outright famine. There were no government subsidies or aid programs. You either grew enough food or you starved. This created a constant state of anxiety and deep-rooted reliance on ancient farming techniques and the unpredictable whims of nature. Beyond the weather, wild animals were a constant threat. Wolves, bears, and other predators roamed the extensive forests, posing dangers to livestock and, on occasion, to humans. Protecting your meager herd was vital for survival, often requiring constant vigilance. Help when needed, would be slow to arrive, if it came at all. If you fell ill or suffered an injury, the nearest healer might be days away, or simply non-existent. A raiding party of bandits or rival lords could descend upon your village with little warning, and help from your feudal lord's distant castle might arrive too late to prevent devastation, plunder, or even massacre. The lack of infrastructure meant that roads were often impassable, especially during winter, further exacerbating the sense of isolation. You would rarely, if ever, see people from outside your immediate community, leading to deeply insular and often suspicious societies. Life in the countryside was physically grueling, even more so than in cities for many. Your days would be spent working the land, building and maintaining rudimentary shelters, and constantly battling the elements. Housing was simple, often single-room dwellings shared with livestock during colder months, providing warmth but also contributing to disease and poor sanitation. Firewood was gathered, water was fetched from wells or rivers, and every necessity was either made by hand or acquired through difficult bartering. There were no modern amenities, no easy access to entertainment beyond local folklore and community gatherings. The stark beauty of nature was offset by its immense, untamed power and its indifference to human suffering. Your modern need for social connection, access to goods, and immediate assistance would leave you feeling profoundly alone and vulnerable in the vast, unforgiving medieval wilderness. Having faced the grim realities of medieval hygiene, food, justice, and the harshness of both urban and rural life, you now encounter the omnipresent and terrifying reality of warfare. Forget the controlled, distant conflicts portrayed on modern news. In the Middle Ages, war was a deeply personal, often localized, and utterly brutal affair that could erupt at any moment, turning your world upside down with little warning. Conflict was a pervasive element of daily life, driven by rival lords vying for land, power, or honor, dynastic claims, religious crusades, or simple acts of banditry and revenge. Imagine living under the constant threat of violence. Your village could be plundered by raiding parties from a neighboring lord, besieged by an invading army, or caught in the crossfire between warring factions. Unlike today's professional armies that often operate far from civilian populations, medieval armies frequently lived off the land, meaning they would seize food, livestock, and supplies from local peasants, often accompanied by widespread violence, rape, and destruction. If you were unlucky enough to live near a contested border or a strategically important castle, your home could be repeatedly burned, rebuilt, and burned again, rendering any attempt at long-term stability impossible. The nature of medieval warfare was intensely brutal. Battles were often fought hand-to-hand with swords, axes, spears, and maces, weapons designed to inflict maximum blunt force trauma, deep lacerations, and crushing injuries. Arrows and crossbow bolts could rain down from a distance, but the real horror lay in close quarters, combat. Casualties were high, and injuries were often grotesque, leading to slow, agonizing deaths from infection, blood loss, or gangrene. There were no Geneva Conventions, no rules of engagement protecting civilians. If your town or castle was besieged, starvation, disease, and the constant threat of a final bloody assault were your daily companions. Surrender might offer little respite, as victors often massacred populations or sold them into slavery. Being a soldier in this era was an even grimmer prospect. A knight though glorified in legend, faced immense physical danger in heavy, uncomfortable armor. Common foot soldiers, often conscripted peasants, were poorly equipped, lacked training, and were utterly expendable. Their lives were cheap, and their deaths often unnoticed. The psychological toll of living in a state of perpetual insecurity, never knowing when the next conflict would erupt, when your home would be destroyed, or when you might be forced to fight, would be immense. Your modern concept of peace and personal safety would be completely shattered. The medieval world was a landscape shaped by endemic violence, where conflict was not an exception, but an ever-present, terrifying reality that could extinguish your life at any moment, often without reason or warning. Having somehow survived the pervasive dangers of medieval warfare, disease, and daily toil, you now face perhaps the most fundamental and inescapable reality of the age: the rigid and often cruel social class system. Forget any modern notions of social mobility, meritocracy, or the ability to forge your own path based on talent or hard work. In the Middle Ages, your entire life, from birth to death, was almost entirely predetermined by the circumstances of your birth. You were born into a specific social stratum, and for the vast majority of people, that was where you would remain, generation after generation. This hierarchical structure, often called feudalism, placed individuals into distinct, largely unchangeable categories: the nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry. If you were among the fortunate few born into the nobility, your life would be one of relative privilege, though still fraught with its own dangers. You would own land, command respect, and hold significant power over those below you. However, even within the nobility, a strict pecking order existed, from the king at the apex down to minor lords. Your life would be consumed by maintaining your lands, participating in wars, political intrigues, and dynastic alliances. You would be expected to fight, to rule, and to uphold a code of chivalry which, while romanticized, often masked brutal realities. Education, though rare for many, would likely be available to you, focusing on military training, estate management, and perhaps Latin. Your marriages would almost certainly be arranged, strategic unions to consolidate power or wealth, with personal affection being a secondary, if present, consideration. Despite your privileges, life was still harsh. Constant warfare meant you could die on the battlefield. Political rivals could plot your downfall, and even nobles were not immune to disease or famine, though they had better resources to cope. However, the overwhelming likelihood is that you would be born into the peasantry, the vast majority of the population. As a peasant, your life would be one of perpetual labor and obligation. Most peasants were serfs, meaning they were tied to the land and could not leave without their lord's permission. You were not owned outright like a slave, but your freedom was severely limited. You worked your own small plot of land to feed your family, but also worked the lord's lands, damen, for several days a week, provided him with a portion of your harvest, and paid various taxes and fees, often in goods or labor rather than coin. You needed the lord's permission to marry, to move, and even to inherit your father's land. Your daily existence was defined by relentless physical labor, as detailed in our previous segment. There was virtually no chance of social advancement. Your children would inherit your status, living the same arduous life as you. The clergy, ranging from humble village priests to powerful bishops and abbots, represented another distinct class. While theoretically open to all, entry into the higher ranks often required wealth or connections. For those who joined, life offered different challenges and opportunities. Monks and nuns committed to lives of prayer and asceticism, often contributing to scholarship and local community welfare. Priests served the spiritual needs of their parishioners. The church held immense spiritual, political, and economic power, owning vast tracts of land and wielding significant influence over kings and commoners alike. Becoming part of the clergy could offer a path to education, safety from direct warfare, and even social mobility for those from lower classes, though it required strict adherence to religious doctrine and a celibate life. Imagine waking up knowing that your entire life's trajectory, your rights, your opportunities, and even your potential for happiness were rigidly prescribed by an accident of birth. Your talents might go unrecognized, your ambitions unfulfilled, simply because you were born to the wrong parents. The concept of individual achievement or self-determination, so central to modern identity, was almost entirely absent. The social order was viewed as divinely ordained, making challenging it a dangerous act of rebellion against both temporal and spiritual authority. Your modern mindset, valuing equality and opportunity, would find the medieval class system an oppressive and inescapable cage, a constant reminder of your predetermined and largely unchangeable place in a rigid, unforgiving world. Having navigated the stratified social order, you now face another significant barrier in medieval times: education and the elusive access to knowledge. Forget universal public schooling, readily available books, or the instantaneous information of the internet. In the Middle Ages, education was a rare privilege, largely confined to a select few, and the very concept of knowledge differed vastly from our empirical, scientific understanding. The vast majority of the population, especially the peasantry, was illiterate. The ability to read and write was a specialized skill, often associated with the clergy and, to a lesser extent, the nobility or wealthy merchants. For most, life was learned through practical experience, oral tradition, and observation, passed down from generation to generation within the family or guild. If you were one of the fortunate few to receive an education, it would likely be through the church. Monasteries and cathedrals often ran schools, primarily to train future clergy. The curriculum was heavily focused on religious texts, Latin, the language of scholarship and the church, rhetoric, and basic arithmetic. The liberal arts, as understood from classical antiquity, were studied, but always through the lens of theology. These schools were rigorous, demanding rote memorization and strict discipline. For a modern student accustomed to diverse subjects, critical thinking, and interactive learning, the medieval scholastic method would feel stifling and restrictive. There were no public libraries as we know them. Books were incredibly rare and expensive, painstakingly copied by hand by scribes, primarily in monastic scriptoria. A single book could cost more than a peasant's entire annual income. The establishment of universities, beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, marked a significant intellectual development. These institutions gathered scholars and students, fostering advanced study in theology, law, and medicine. However, attending university was a privilege reserved for the wealthy, or those sponsored by the church. The curriculum was still heavily dominated by scholasticism, the application of logic to understand and explain religious doctrine. Scientific inquiry, as we understand it, was in its infancy and often subservient to theological frameworks. Experiments were rare, and knowledge was largely derived from ancient texts and philosophical reasoning rather than empirical observation. Furthermore, the spread of information was agonizingly slow and often inaccurate. News traveled by word of mouth, through travelers, or via official decrees read aloud in town squares. Rumors and superstitions often replaced verifiable facts. The printing press would not be invented until the mid-15th century, meaning the widespread dissemination of ideas was impossible for most of the Middle Ages. The church held immense power over knowledge, often determining what could be studied, written, and read. Ideas deemed heretical could lead to severe punishment, limiting intellectual freedom. Imagine trying to navigate a world where verifiable facts are scarce, where superstition reigns, and where the prevailing wisdom on medicine, science, and the natural world is based on incomplete or incorrect understanding. Your modern critical thinking skills and reliance on evidence would be constantly challenged and perhaps even seen as dangerous or heretical. Any attempt to introduce scientific concepts like the heliocentric model of the universe, which contradicted church doctrine, could have dire consequences. The sheer lack of widespread knowledge, combined with the difficulty of acquiring it, would leave your modern, information-saturated mind feeling utterly bewildered and intellectually starved. The medieval world would prove a stark reminder of how recent and fragile our widespread access to knowledge truly is. You've endured the challenges of social status and limited knowledge. Now, let's consider something seemingly trivial, but profoundly impactful on your daily medieval existence: your clothes. Forget comfort, versatility, or personal expression through fashion. Medieval clothing was primarily about practicality, durability, and a strict adherence to social norms. Your wardrobe would be minimal, ill-fitting by modern standards, and perpetually uncomfortable, reflecting both your station in life and the harsh realities of the environment. For the vast majority, meaning the peasant class, your clothes would be made from coarse, undyed wool or linen. These fabrics, though durable, were scratchy, heavy, and lacked the breathability or softness of modern materials. Colors were muted, often browns, grays, or natural off-whites, as dyes were expensive and limited. You would likely own only one or two sets of outer garments: a tunic, possibly a cloak, or a simple dress, which would be worn day in and day out for weeks or months without proper washing. Undergarments might be made of linen, offering a slightly softer layer against the skin, but these too would be rarely washed. Imagine wearing itchy, stiff wool constantly, regardless of the weather. In summer, you would be hot and sweaty, the heavy fabric trapping moisture and odors. In winter, while offering some warmth, the material would become damp and heavy when wet, slow to dry, and prone to becoming a breeding ground for mildew and unpleasant smells, adding to the general lack of hygiene we discussed earlier. The lack of proper cleaning meant your clothes would quickly become soiled, stained, and infested with fleas, lice, and other vermin, clinging to you at all times. Beyond comfort, medieval clothing also dictated your social identity. Sumptuary laws though not always strictly enforced, often dictated what colors, fabrics, and styles people of different social classes were allowed to wear. A peasant caught wearing silk or vibrant dyes could face fines or punishment, as it blurred the visual distinction between the classes. Noble clothing, while more luxurious, was often equally uncomfortable and impractical. Layers of heavy fabrics, elaborate embroidery, restrictive corsetry for women, and impractical sleeves or headdresses limited movement and added considerable weight. Knight's armor, while vital for protection, was incredibly heavy, cumbersome, and restrictive, making simple movements exhausting, let alone fighting for hours. Footwear was another significant challenge. Peasants typically wore simple leather shoes, or even just wrapped cloths on their feet, offering little comfort or protection from the elements, the mud, or the sharp objects on the ground. For long journeys or farm work, these would quickly deteriorate, leading to blisters, cuts, and infections. There were no specialized shoes for different activities, no shock absorption, and certainly no arch support. The sheer discomfort and impracticality of medieval clothing would be a constant source of irritation for your modern body. Accustomed to lightweight, breathable, and comfortable garments designed for every activity imaginable. Your concept of personal style would be replaced by a rigid uniform of discomfort, a visual testament to your unchangeable place in society. You've navigated the practicalities of medieval attire, but now let's delve into the most emotionally challenging aspect of medieval life for a modern person: childhood and family dynamics. Forget the protected, extended childhoods, modern pediatrics, or the emphasis on individual emotional development that we value today. In the Middle Ages, childhood was often brief, brutal, and fraught with peril, and family life was structured more around survival and economic necessity than emotional bonding in the modern sense. The most shocking reality was the horrifyingly high rate of infant and child mortality. It was common for families to have many children, partly as a form of social security for old age, but primarily because so few were expected to survive. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and the complete lack of modern medical care meant that a significant percentage of children would not live past their first birthday, and many more would not reach adulthood. It was not uncommon for a family to lose half or even more of their offspring. This constant threat of loss undoubtedly shaped parental emotions, leading to a degree of emotional detachment as a coping mechanism, though deep love certainly existed. The idea of mourning for each lost child with the same intensity as a modern parent might have been too overwhelming to bear. Children, from a very young age, were seen as economic assets. There was no concept of a play-based early childhood or a protected adolescence. As soon as a child was physically able, typically around age 5 or 6, they would be expected to contribute to the household labor. This meant chores like fetching water, tending to animals, helping in the fields, or assisting with crafts. By their early teens, children were often considered miniature adults, capable of performing demanding labor. Boys might begin apprenticeships, and girls would be trained in household management and prepared for marriage. Education, as discussed, was almost non-existent for peasant children, who learned what they needed for their future roles through direct participation. Play, when it occurred, was often simple and unstructured, using natural materials rather than toys. There was no widespread emphasis on formal education or intellectual development for the masses. Marriage ages were also significantly different. While the church aimed for minimum ages, engagements could be made very early, and marriages for peasant girls often occurred in their mid to late teens, and for boys slightly later. These marriages were typically arranged by parents with economic and social considerations far outweighing personal choice or romantic love. Affection and companionship might develop over time, but the primary purpose was procreation and the creation of economic units. The family unit itself was crucial for survival, often extending beyond the nuclear family to include grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins living in close proximity or within the same household. This provided a vital support network for labor and security, but also meant less individual privacy and more communal decision-making. The lack of privacy, constant hard labor, and the ever-present shadow of death would make medieval childhood and family life incredibly stressful and emotionally draining for anyone used to the protected, child-centric environments of today. Your modern sensibilities about the sanctity of childhood and the emotional bonds within a family would be severely challenged by the stark realities of medieval survival. You've confronted the harsh realities of medieval family life and the brevity of childhood. Now, let's turn to the all-encompassing force that permeated every aspect of medieval existence: religion and the immense power of the church. Forget modern secular societies, religious pluralism, or the separation of church and state. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was the dominant institution, wielding unparalleled spiritual, political, and economic authority that shaped literally every moment of your life, from birth to death and beyond. Imagine waking up in a world where the church dictated not only your spiritual beliefs, but also your daily routine, your moral code, and even the laws of the land. Sundays and holy days were strictly observed, with compulsory attendance at Mass. The ringing of church bells marked the hours of the day, guiding peasant labor and city life. Every significant life event, birth, marriage, death, was consecrated by the church. You would be baptized as an infant, married in a church ceremony, and ultimately buried in consecrated ground, with the belief that your soul's salvation depended on the church's sacraments. The fear of eternal damnation was a palpable, terrifying force. The church taught that sin led to hell, and salvation could only be achieved through faith, good works, and the sacraments administered by priests. This fear was reinforced by vivid imagery in art, sermons that depicted the horrors of hell, and the widespread belief in purgatory. Confession of sins to a priest was mandatory, and penance was often prescribed. Indulgences, offering remission from temporal punishment for sins, were also sold, creating a complex spiritual economy that heavily influenced people's lives and finances. The church was also the largest landowner in Europe, possessing vast estates and collecting tithes, a tenth of your produce or income, from every household, regardless of your personal wealth. This made it immensely wealthy and powerful, enabling it to build magnificent cathedrals, maintain armies, and even challenge the authority of kings. Bishops and abbots often held more political power than many secular lords. The Pope, as the head of the church, held immense spiritual authority, capable of excommunicating kings and entire nations, a powerful weapon that could cripple a ruler's legitimacy. Education, as we discussed, was largely monopolized by the church. Monasteries were centers of learning, preserving ancient texts and fostering scholarship. However, this also meant that the church controlled the narrative and often suppressed ideas deemed heretical or contrary to its doctrine. Scientific inquiry was often viewed with suspicion if it contradicted theological interpretations of the world. The Inquisition, in various forms, hunted down and punished those accused of heresy, leading to torture and execution. Your modern reliance on individual thought, critical inquiry, and perhaps a more personal, less institutionalized approach to spirituality would be dangerous in this environment. Questioning church dogma could lead to excommunication, branding you an outcast from your community and condemning your soul to eternal damnation in the eyes of society. Expressing skepticism about miracles or religious relics could brand you a heretic. The sheer pervasiveness of religious authority, its control over information, its economic might, and its ability to inspire both profound devotion and paralyzing fear would make the medieval world an intensely restrictive and often terrifying place for a modern, secular mind. Your life would be lived under the constant, watchful eye of an omnipresent religious institution that left no aspect of existence untouched. You've survived the pervasive influence of the medieval church, but now consider what little respite you might find in entertainment and leisure. Forget Netflix, video games, concerts, or even a quiet evening with a book and a cup of tea. In the Middle Ages, leisure was a concept drastically different from our modern understanding, often intertwined with communal activity, religious observance, or brutal spectacle, and always limited by the demands of labor and the scarcity of resources. True, undirected free time was a rarity for most. For the vast majority of peasants, entertainment was rudimentary and communal. It often revolved around seasonal festivals tied to the agricultural calendar or religious holidays. These might involve feasting, if food was abundant, dancing, singing, and simple games. Storytelling was a vital form of entertainment, often shared orally around a fire, passing down myths, legends, and local histories. Minstrels and jongleurs, traveling performers, might occasionally visit a village or castle, bringing news, songs, and acrobatic feats, but these were infrequent occurrences. Life was characterized by simplicity, and so too were its diversions. Your modern need for constant stimulation, novelty, and diverse entertainment options would be profoundly unfulfilled. For the nobility, leisure activities were more elaborate, but often still physically demanding and often violent. Hunting was a primary pastime, not just for sport, but also as a means of acquiring food and demonstrating skill. Falconry, a sophisticated form of hunting with birds of prey, was highly esteemed. Tournaments, particularly jousting, were grand spectacles of martial prowess and entertainment, drawing large crowds. While romanticized today, these events were incredibly dangerous, often resulting in severe injury or death for the participants. Chess and dice were popular indoor games, but gambling could lead to significant losses. Feasts in castles were extravagant affairs, featuring copious amounts of food, drink, and entertainment from jesters and musicians. But even these were largely about displaying wealth and power. Public spectacles, often brutal, were also a form of entertainment for all classes. Public executions, though a form of justice, were also well-attended events. Animal baiting, where dogs were set upon bears or bulls, was another popular, cruel diversion. bear baiting pits were common sights in towns. The line between entertainment and brutality was often blurred, reflecting the harshness of daily life. There were no public theaters in the modern sense. Plays, often morality plays or mysteries, were performed by traveling troupes or local guilds, typically with religious themes and a didactic purpose. Music was predominantly sacred, performed in churches or folk music, often simple and repetitive. The biggest challenge for a modern mind would be the sheer lack of choice and the scarcity of personal, solitary entertainment. There were no personal hobbies that required complex equipment or extensive quiet time. Reading, if you were literate, was a rare and treasured activity, as books were so scarce. Your evenings would largely be spent in darkness after sundown, with limited artificial light, meaning quiet contemplation or early sleep. The concept of Netflix and chill would be unimaginable. Instead, you might be telling stories by candlelight or simply staring into the fire. The medieval approach to leisure was fundamentally communal, physical, and often dangerous, utterly alien to our individualistic, comfort-driven pursuits. Your boredom threshold would be tested to its absolute limits, and your need for varied, personal entertainment would go completely unaddressed. Having explored the limited and often brutal forms of medieval entertainment, we now turn to a critical aspect of society that would dramatically define your existence if you were a woman: your role and status. Forget modern feminism, equal rights, or even basic legal autonomy. In the Middle Ages, women, regardless of their social class, largely existed within a patriarchal system where their lives were primarily defined by their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, or widows, and their roles as producers of heirs and managers of the household. Their legal, economic, and social rights were severely curtailed compared to men, making their lives inherently more precarious and restrictive. If you were born a woman in the peasant class, your life would be a relentless cycle of hard labor, often indistinguishable from that of men, but with the added burdens of childbearing and household management. You would work in the fields alongside men, performing arduous tasks like planting, harvesting, and weeding. Within the home, your duties were equally demanding: grinding grain, baking bread, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, making and repairing clothes, fetching water, collecting firewood, and preparing meals. Childbearing was a constant expectation, with women often having numerous pregnancies throughout their fertile years, facing the constant and terrifying risk of death during childbirth. Maternal mortality rates were incredibly high, making each birth a life-threatening ordeal. Your value was often tied to your ability to produce healthy children, especially sons. For women of the noble class, life was different, but still highly constrained. While they did not typically engage in manual labor, their lives were dictated by the demands of managing large households and estates in their husband's absence, or through a strict upbringing aimed at securing a strategic marriage. Education for noble women often focused on managing servants, accounting for household expenses, and perhaps basic literacy or needlework. Marriages were almost universally arranged, often from a young age, serving as political alliances or means of consolidating wealth and power between noble families. Personal affection was a secondary, or often non-existent, consideration. A woman's primary duty was to produce male heirs to continue the family line and ensure the stability of the inheritance. Noble women could wield significant influence behind the scenes through their husbands or sons, but rarely held direct political power themselves. Legally, women had limited rights. They could not typically own property independently, unless they were unmarried or widowed, and even then, with restrictions, initiate legal proceedings or represent themselves in court without a male guardian. Their testimony was often considered less reliable than a man's. The church also played a significant role in defining women's status, often promoting an image of women as inherently weaker, more prone to sin, Eve's legacy, and subordinate to men, while simultaneously venerating the Virgin Mary. However, monastic life did offer some women, particularly noble women, an alternative path to education, leadership as abbesses, and spiritual fulfillment, providing a degree of autonomy otherwise unattainable. Imagine living in a world where your worth is largely tied to your reproductive capacity and your ability to serve a man and family unit. Your voice would be rarely heard, your opinions often dismissed, and your legal rights minimal. The constant fear of childbirth, the relentless domestic and field labor, and the complete lack of personal agency would make medieval life a profoundly challenging and often oppressive experience for any modern woman accustomed to autonomy, career choices, and gender equality. Your modern expectations of parity would be met with overwhelming societal resistance and a life of prescribed, rigid roles. You've explored the prescribed roles for women. Now let's debunk another romanticized medieval figure, the knight. Forget the shining paragon of chivalry depicted in legends. While courage and skill were certainly present, the life of a medieval knight was far from glamorous. It was a brutal existence of rigorous training, constant danger, immense physical demands, and often dubious morality, utterly unlike the polished image of fairy tales. A knight's life began early, often as a page at around 7 years old, serving in a lord's household and learning manners, basic literacy, and preliminary combat skills. By their early teens, they would become squires, personal attendants to a knight, where their training intensified dramatically. This involved daily, grueling physical exercise, wrestling, running, jumping, and mastering a variety of weapons. They would practice with heavy swords, lances, and shields, often on horseback, for hours each day. This was not a quick process. Becoming a skilled warrior required years of intense, painful dedication. There were no modern sports medicine or physical therapists to aid recovery from injuries during this arduous training. The very equipment of a knight was a challenge. Full plate armor, though iconic, was incredibly heavy, weighing anywhere from 50 to 70 pounds, 23 to 32 kilograms. While expertly designed to distribute weight, wearing it for extended periods, let alone fighting in it, was exhausting. Imagine running or even walking long distances in this heavy suit, often under the blazing sun or in pouring rain. It restricted movement, made breathing difficult, and offered limited visibility through the visor. Inside, it could be incredibly hot and stifling. Despite its protection, armor was not impenetrable. Crushing blows from maces and hammers, or piercing thrusts from swords and lances, could still cause severe, often fatal, injuries. A fall from a horse in full armor could easily break bones or cause internal damage. The reality of combat was far from the clean, stylized duels of cinema. Medieval battles were chaotic, bloody, and terrifying. Swords clanged, arrows rained down, and the air was filled with screams, the stench of blood, and the roar of men. Knights engaged in hand-to-hand combat, designed to maim and kill. Wounds were horrific. Severed limbs, crushed bones, deep gashes, and internal injuries were common. Infection, as discussed in Part 4, was almost a certainty for any serious wound, meaning even surviving a battle often led to a slow, agonizing death days or weeks later. There was no concept of a safe zone for combatants. Even outside of pitched battles, skirmishes, ambushes, and sieges were constant threats. Beyond the physical brutality, the knightly life involved significant psychological strain. They were often tasked with brutal duties, such as leading raids, enforcing the Lord's will on rebellious peasants, or participating in sieges where starvation and cruelty were common tactics. The romanticized code of chivalry, emphasizing honor, courage, and protecting the weak, was often more of an ideal than a consistent practice. Knights frequently participated in atrocities, plunder, and acts of violence that would horrify a modern sensibility. Your modern aversion to violence, your empathy for civilian casualties, and your expectation of fair play would be a crippling liability on the medieval battlefield. Living the life of a knight meant embracing a reality of constant danger, profound physical hardship, and a moral landscape that was often as brutal as the battles themselves. Having faced the harsh realities of knighthood, let's now consider forces beyond human control that would quickly end your medieval journey: natural disasters and unforgiving environmental conditions. Forget sophisticated early warning systems, advanced infrastructure, or global relief efforts. In the Middle Ages, humanity was profoundly vulnerable to the whims of nature, and a single adverse event could spell instant doom for individuals and entire communities. Imagine enduring a prolonged drought. Your crops wither in the fields, livestock die of thirst, and wells run dry. Without modern irrigation techniques or the ability to import water from distant sources, your community would face imminent starvation and widespread disease. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, caused by years of unusually heavy rains and cold summers, devastated northern Europe, leading to millions of deaths and widespread social breakdown. This wasn't just a bad year. It was a cascade of failures that brought entire regions to their knees. Your reliance on a stable food supply, ensured by modern agricultural technology and global trade, would offer no protection against such a cataclysm. Conversely, excessive rainfall and flooding posed equally dire threats. Rivers would burst their banks, inundating villages, destroying crops, and washing away homes and people. Roads would become impassable mud pits, isolating communities and preventing any aid from reaching them. Stagnant floodwaters would then become breeding grounds for waterborne diseases, turning a natural disaster into a health catastrophe. There were no robust flood defenses, no emergency services to rescue those trapped, and no clean water supplies to prevent subsequent epidemics. Your ability to simply relocate or expect government assistance would be entirely absent. Then there were the harsh winters, without central heating, insulated homes, or warm, lightweight clothing. Surviving the cold was a monumental challenge. Homes were often drafty, heated only by a central hearth that filled the dwelling with smoke. Fuel, usually firewood, had to be painstakingly gathered and stored, a demanding task that consumed significant time and energy. Frostbite, hypothermia, and respiratory illnesses caused by smoky, damp living conditions were common killers. Deep snows could isolate villages for months, cutting off supplies and exacerbating food shortages. Your modern resilience to cold, relying on technology and warm layers, would be quickly overwhelmed by the relentless, pervasive chill of a medieval winter. Beyond the immediate threats, the medieval environment was largely untamed and unpredictable. Large, dense forests harbored wild animals like wolves and bears, which posed a threat to livestock and occasionally to humans. Unmanaged land could easily revert to wilderness, reducing arable land. Earthquakes, while less frequent than droughts or floods, could be devastating in regions like the Mediterranean, toppling poorly constructed buildings and causing widespread destruction with no warning. The complete lack of scientific understanding regarding these phenomena meant that they were often attributed to divine wrath or malevolent forces, fostering immense fear and superstition rather than practical preparation. Your modern understanding of meteorology, geology, and disaster preparedness would be entirely useless. You would be utterly at the mercy of environmental forces, a constant reminder of humanity's smallness and vulnerability in a world where nature truly held all the power, often deciding your fate with a swift, merciless hand. You've endured the unyielding hardships of medieval life, the appalling hygiene, the constant threat of starvation, the brutal arbitrary justice, the rigid social hierarchy, the severe lack of knowledge, the uncomfortable attire, the heartbreaking reality of childhood, the church's pervasive control, the raw danger of warfare, and the unforgiving power of nature. You would not have lasted a day. Your modern body, your modern mind, and your modern expectations would have quickly succumbed to the relentless challenges of the Middle Ages. Let's briefly summarize the overwhelming realities. Your senses would be assaulted by pervasive filth and stench. Your body would be constantly battling parasites and suffering from inadequate nutrition, making you vulnerable to widespread diseases that had no cure. A simple infection could be a death sentence. Justice was arbitrary and brutal, with torture and public executions being common. Your social status was fixed at birth, offering little to no opportunity for advancement, and your personal freedoms were severely limited. Knowledge was scarce, information traveled slowly, and superstition often trumped science. Your daily life would be a relentless cycle of physical labor, with little leisure and constant exposure to the elements. Travel was dangerous and arduous. Cities were overcrowded, unsanitary death traps, while rural life offered crushing isolation and vulnerability to nature's whims. If you were a woman, your life would be defined by male authority and the terrifying risks of childbirth. If a man, you might face conscription into brutal, devastating wars. You would live under the constant, omnipresent authority of a powerful church, whose doctrines dictated your every action and thought, with the threat of eternal damnation looming large. Now, reflect on the world you currently inhabit. We live in an age of unprecedented comfort, safety, and opportunity. We take for granted clean water, readily available food, advanced medical care, and effective sanitation systems that have eliminated diseases that once wiped out millions. We enjoy universal education, instantaneous global communication, and access to a vast ocean of knowledge. Our justice systems, though imperfect, strive for fairness and due process. We have freedom of movement, the ability to choose our professions, and a degree of social mobility that was unimaginable for the medieval commoner. Our homes are warm in winter and cool in summer. Our food is safe and abundant. Our lives are significantly longer, healthier, and safer than any person could have dreamed of in the Middle Ages. The goal of this series was not just to highlight the hardships of the past, but to foster a profound appreciation for the advancements and luxuries we often take for granted in the modern world. Every single day, we benefit from centuries of progress, scientific discovery, and social evolution that have transformed human existence. The Middle Ages serve as a stark, visceral reminder of just how fragile our progress once was, and how precious our current comforts truly are. So, the next time you enjoy a hot shower, a diverse meal, or scroll through your phone, remember the medieval world you wouldn't have lasted a day in. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? We are, indeed, incredibly fortunate to live in the modern age,